And then Brock screwed it up. It's Brock's fault. I just wanted to sit with her.
Yeah. Write that down.
All right, everyone, by the clock in the back of the room, it is 5:30 p.m. We are here in the North Platte City Council chambers, and it's Thursday, May 18th, 2023. Tonight, we are having a combined work session. We have with us members of the City Council, the Civil Service Commission, Community Redevelopment Authority, Board of Adjustment, Planning Commission, Quality Growth Fund Committee. Thank you all for attending. These are some of the people who make things happen in our great community, so we really appreciate your service and you taking the time to be with us tonight. We will have some tremendous education tonight, but first we're calling the meeting to order before I talk anymore. Angie, this is going to be the longest roll call you've probably done for a while. Go for it.
Okay, City Council, Nisley,
Here.
Tryon. Here. Bowles.
Here.
Lucas. Garrick.
Here.
Flanders.
Here.
Reeker.
Here.
Woods.
Here.
Board of Adjustment, Backenstoes.
Here.
Fudge.
Yes.
Patterson. Peterson.
Here.
Stefka. Wilkie.
Here.
Civil Service Commission, Curry.
Here.
O'Brien.
Here.
Ferris. Community Redevelopment Authority, Lucas.
Here.
Mendenhall.
Here.
Patterson. Staroska.
Present.
Wilkie.
Here.
Planning Commission, Bain.
Here.
Davies.
Here.
Forbes. Here. Fudge.
Here.
Jett.
Here.
Matthews. Here. Weber. Whirl. Here. Quality Growth Fund, Holm. Johansson. Keenan.
Here.
Ferris. Whirl.
Here.
That's it.
Thank you. A current copy of the Open Meetings Act of the State of Nebraska is posted on the wall at the back of the council chambers, roughly above Mr. Backenstoe's mostly bald head. Sorry, Jim. Okay. I'm sure you will. I'm not too far behind you. No formal vote or action will be taken at this meeting by any of the various committees that are here. I repeat, no formal action or vote will be taken by anyone at this meeting. We're kicking off tonight by a presentation by Mr. Mike Bacon, who will be giving us, well, it's entitled here on the screen, Tax Increment Financing 101. Mr. Bacon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council, and all of you that have been sentenced to this. Thank you for asking me. Questions are encouraged. This is a really tough thing to understand and get your head around. Personally, I love to get into the details. I taught an online class for lawyers on a portion of TIF, and it was one of those where somebody left their mic on and I could hear them snoring, and I heard a couple fall off out of their chair. If you ask my wife, when I get going on something like this, she says, honey, you're exceeding my curiosity. So, anyway.
That's quite an advertisement for your presentation.
Okay. Well, always start with a little humor. This is before I met Mr. Jacobson. 25 years ago. And here we are today. So thank you very much for talking about, I was going to try and get cornrows, but they said I didn't have the material. So this is after TIF started. So TIF is something that is really a powerful tool to develop your community. It was established in 1974 by a vote of the people of the state of Nebraska. You can't use tax money to benefit any one individual. It has to be to benefit the whole. And so they made an exception with this constitutional amendment allowing you to use tax dollars that essentially at the end of the day benefit individuals. The original testimony for TIF, I went back and read that, and when they were arguing, trying to convince the legislator to put a legislative bill out to adopt this amendment, it was very, very interesting, except for one sentence in all of that testimony. They all talked about using TIF for housing. And one lady said, and perhaps we could do a little commercial establishment in the neighborhood. So we can use TIF to acquire, redevelop, rehabilitate substandard and blighted properties. That's stuck, that term is stuck in the Constitution, so we can't change it. We can't talk about development unless we submit to the vote of the people. And so on 4 separate occasions, something changing this provision has been put in front of the voters of the state of Nebraska and approved. The last one was in 2020 when the 15-year limitation in the Constitution was extended to 20 years for extremely blighted areas, which sort of surprised me. I voted against it, if you're interested at all. So we are stuck using TIF only in areas that are blighted and substandard. Now, the legislature can't change the terminology, but what it can change is what qualifies as blighted and substandard. I worked in another state where much looser standards, and they were able to do TIF out to 40 years, which is extreme in my view. So in order to get something blighted in North Platte, you have to now have a study. Someone has to go through and hold up this area of town to the standards that are set in the statute. Prior to this last statutory change, you didn't have to have a study. We have always had a study to do that. Anybody can bring the council a study that says this area is blighted and substandard. Your job then is to send it on to planning and zoning. If you don't send it to planning and zoning, you're done. Okay? It goes to planning and zoning for a hearing so they can opine on whether that's a good idea or not, or suggest a change in the area. And it comes back to you again for a public hearing. And at the public hearing, if you decide no, it's done again. If you say yes, we make certain findings, we declare it blighted and substandard and in need of redevelopment, then you can do TIF. And if the easiest way to understand it is TIF provides a magic way, not normal way of providing funding, but it's based on a bargain. I can't do this project unless I get TIF, and I will do it. You allow me to build the project and allow me the increase in taxes back for up to 15 years to help fund it. So once we get all the way through the Planning Commission, all the way through City Council, then we can start going through the process with the Community Redevelopment Authority. The Community Redevelopment Authority is authorized by the statutes and then by an ordinance of the council. The first couple of these that we did 25 or 27 years ago, the council sat in as basically the community development agency. Since that time, the authority has been appointed and done 27 projects, I think, to date. They are the people with the power to operate only in blighted and substandard areas. Now, there's one proviso that says you can go outside of a blighted and substandard area if you as the council say, yes, we'll let you do that, but you can't TIF outside that area, but you can use the powers of a redevelopment authority. Powers of a redevelopment authority, if you approve, they can actually do a 2.6% tax on a $100 valuation to give them operating funds to do non-TIF stuff. They have not done that, but that's a statutory authorization. They can buy ground, they can sell ground, they can develop ground, they can prepare ground for redevelopment, they can ask for bids, they can make grants, which is very important because that's how people get the TIF dollars. They are granted those TIF funds, and they can borrow funds or issue bonds. And the issuance of the bonds is important because that's where they can borrow money to give to redevelopers, and that's the only way TIF can be used. We can't use TIF to pay for operations of the redevelopment authority. You have to use those TIF dollars to pay off debt or bonds that are issued by the redevelopment authority. So we'll get into that process so people understand that. Okay. So this is kind of confusing, and people want to know, well, how do I get some of them TIF dollars? You have to file an application, and the application requires a lot of stuff, like what do you want to do? What's it going to cost? What's going to be the benefit to the city? How many people are you going to hire? What's the valuation going to be? And how come you need TIF? People need to understand that TIF is not a matter of right. TIF is a matter of grace. Just because you TIF one motel doesn't mean you have to TIF all of them. So that's the first thing, matter of grace. Where do you, in your blighted and substandard area, you can categorize it and focus on what's the biggest bang for the buck in this area to eliminate the blight and substandard conditions. In some small towns, it might be a C-store. In this town, it might be, let's say a packing plant, or a distribution center for Walmart, those types of things. We have, that application has to address the zoning that is there, the zoning change is needed, whether or not it has to be subdivided, is it in a flood zone, and all of that stuff. In addition, we have to get some information for a cost-benefit study. If we take the base taxes off a lot and we build a Walmart distribution center, and we take the taxes off that Walmart distribution center, we may have a lot of activity from the Walmart distribution center that costs people more money as a taxpayer. Do you have to shovel, do you have to clean the snow off that extra route out there? Do you have to extend a sewer water line out there? Are you going to bring a lot of children to the school system and we have to hire more teachers, have to build more buildings and those types of things? So it forces the CRA to formally take a look at all of those costs. Do you have enough police? Does your fire system need any more equipment or any more manpower? Those are the types of things that the CRA is charged with doing, and you have a responsibility to look at. Are there any sailors here? Retired sailors, sailor veterans? No? Good. So let's use the Subic Naval Base as an example. Should you TIF the Subic Naval Base? No, because when the fleet comes in, you're going to need a lot more ambulance drivers and a lot more MPs for a couple of days. And those types of costs have to be taken into account. So we get that document and it goes to the redevelopment authority. And they can look at it and say, nah, we don't like it. Project's done. City councils can't say, you know, put it back on the agenda. The CRA holds all the power and says, no, it's done. We're not going to submit it. So if they do say, yeah, we like this, then we prepare a redevelopment plan. The redevelopment plan has a bunch of stuff that you have to put in statutorily. Explain what you're doing, explain where you're going, what's the legal description, what's the long-range impact, and so forth. It is the outline, if you will, of the project. So that's considered by the redevelopment authority. When all that's there, they don't approve that plan. They send it off to the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission's job is to see if it is consistent with the comprehensive plan. Now, I've had planning commissions decide, we don't like that guy, so we're going to recommend not doing it. We don't like TIF because it's against my Buddhist philosophy. We don't think you ought to have that much TIF. That is not the job of the Planning Commission. Does this fit in that area? Now, if it's a hog rendering facility in a residential area, they're going to say no. Okay, give you that recommendation. Once that's done, and this is really obtuse, it goes from CRA to Planning Commission, back to CRA, and then back to you. CRA can get it back from the Planning Commission and say, no, we don't like it, we're not going to forward it to the council. You're done. If they do send it to the council, then you have the hearing and you can listen to all of the complaints. And again, the buck stops in your chairs. You can decide, yes, it's good or not. Once you approve it, it comes back and we prepare a redevelopment contract. So the redevelopment contract is about a 40-page document that says, okay, here's the deal. You redeveloper are going to do all of these things, and we will give you some money to do these things and bind you. We can have all kinds of restrictions in there on what you use the money for, how you're going to manage the property, whether or not you're going to have odor control devices and those types of things in that redevelopment contract. The other thing that people sometimes forget is the but-for test. Just because you come up and say, I want TIF, and we've had this before, I want my dip at the bucket, that's not appropriate. You can only use TIF if it's not otherwise economically feasible. Well, how do you prove that? Well, one, if you're in competition for recruiting a project from another community, says, I got a better deal over here, so I'm not coming, that's a pretty good argument that you ought to use TIF to make it economically feasible to get them.
Hey, Mike. Since I apologize, I kicked the air on. Would you kind of stay in front of the mic there while the air is running,
Okay.
please? Thank you. So the folks at home can hear you.
Okay. All right. So the other major tests on financial feasibility or economic feasibility is the lender requires tax increment financing as part of the capital stack. Well, what does that mean? Many years ago, a capital stack, there were two components to that. Number one, how much equity do you have? And number two, how much can you borrow to get this done? Because of significantly increased costs, because of significant raises in interest rates and economic instability, you have to have more pieces to your stack in order to pay for your project. So you need equity, you need debt, you may need what's called mezzanine debt, you may need quasi capital, someone that gets preferred stock, and then you can get tax increment financing or maybe other funding from Department of Economic Development or the Economic Development Administration. So they have to prove, and we have to document, the financial infeasibility. Most cases we get the letter from the lender saying, I'm not going to loan this guy the money. We've got a gap we have to close. Or in the case of a project that you approved 2 days ago, the apartment complex, if you take a look at the rate of return for their investment, they could have put their money in CDs and made more than they were going to make by just doing the apartments. So TIF helped get it up to somewhere rate of return that was sort of reasonable. It's still going to be a push for them. The one thing I would caution you about is I have had so many people come up to me and say, I know for a fact that they were going to do that project whether they got TIF or not. And it's generally the guy from the third bar stool down or the guy at the coffee table. And in Bill's business and in my business, we know a lot of stuff that we can't tell the world, but I sit in on a lot of those conversations where you're trying to get funding out of a lender, and yeah, there's a gap there, and it has nothing to do with what someone heard as a rumor, almost always. So here's how the magic works. This is a piece of property with an existing tax base, and on the left-hand side you will see a green line. That's the start of a TIF project, and on the red end you see the ending 15 years that we can capture the taxes. So what we do, the yellow line, the existing tax base, is frozen in time. So that value is frozen in time. The taxes on that value can change based on the consolidated levy that you get, so that can go up or down. But the tax increment, which is shown in orange, is the valuation increase as a result of building the project. And here's where you see the description bondable revenue. We can take for up to 15 years that increase in taxes. The project has to pay both taxes, from the yellow and from the orange. And they're both paid at the same time and with the same delinquency dates to the county treasurer. That bondable revenue we can calculate and figure out how much of a bond we can issue and give those bond proceeds to the developer to help make the project go. So the developer, if you think about this, or you, if you're not a developer, you build a house, you're going to have to pay the taxes anyway. You build this project, you're going to have to pay those real estate taxes. But we're going to use those real estate tax increase to help give you some free money to close the capital stack gap. So over the 15 years, they're making their tax payments to the county treasurer. The county treasurer makes those tax payments on the increment back to the city, and the city makes the bond payments. So here's a way to view what the deal is, what the handshake is with the community. We will allow you to use the funding in the orange for up to 15 years. And then we have all of those taxes in the yellow for the life of that structure going forward. Why is that a good deal? If you run, let's say the existing tax base is $100,000. You got a 2% tax rate, skosh over that here. So that's $2,000 a year in real property taxes that goes to the school district, goes to the county, goes to the NRD, goes to the city. 15 years at $2,000 is going to be $30,000 that the taxing entities are going to get during that time period. Now, if we build a $1 million project in the orange, you're still going to get your $30,000 at the end of 15 years, but in the 16th year, you're going to get another $20,000. And in the meantime, what you're going to get is all the personal property tax is going to be paid into all those taxing entities. All the sales tax generated is going to be paid into those taxing entities. And the benefit is that for giving up $30,000, you're going to collect tons more than that at the end of the day, and you're going to get a new structure or a rehabilitated structure in something that you have decided isn't the best part of town. And so at the end of the day, whatever the bond size is a gift to the individual to undertake the project. Okay. I'll go back one piece here. You see on the tax increment in the orange, and then above the grid line, you see a sloping orange line. That's the increase in valuation that can occur over time. And what happens is if you get excess revenue in that area, taxes go up, valuation goes up. We have a fixed number for that TIF bond. So if the taxes come in faster than we expect, TIF bond gets paid off earlier, and everything goes on the tax rolls. That has been done a number of times in your community because I think the largest one was Walmart that came off faster, and that's like a $25 million valuation. So, and I think there are some others that the taxes went up faster than they expected. So, okay. TIF bond funding. The CRA issues a bond to get money to help the developer. A bond that should scare you as members of the anyone associated with city government, because generally you think I'm going to have to levy taxes to pay off that bond. That's not the case. There is, by statute and by the documents that we draft, there is zero responsibility for any of that debt for any taxpayer. The only cost that you have is Dawn, because she has to cash the checks and make the payments. And she does an excellent job of that. She's given me some wonderful data that I'll show you at the end of our conversation here. I've gotten questions, what does that do to our bond rating? It doesn't touch your bond rating because those aren't sold on the market. Who buys the bond? The developer. Now, you have the authority statutorily to buy the bond, And out of the 200 and however many projects I've done that one time. Even on the Walmart distribution center, the city didn't buy the bond. The banks did it after Sam Walton said he'd guarantee the payment, so, anyway. The only thing that pays that bond off is that increment in the taxes. What could change that? We could think that the valuation was gonna be $300 million, like we did on sustainable beef. But then we visited with the assessor and said, no, maybe it'll be $115 million. So the bond's gonna be significantly less than we originally planned. So valuation can change, it can go down, it can go up. The tax levies can go down, believe it or not. I have seen them go down, especially in large school districts. When the valuation of ag land went up, it pushed everybody else's valuations down. So the redeveloper is the buyer of the bond. All the risk is on him. If he can't get it built in time or doesn't have the valuation in time, then it's his problem, not the city's, not the CRA's. How does this, and what you end up with is a piece of paper that says bond. That's it, no money. So what happens is the redeveloper will take this to the lender and say, here's a promise of the city to pay over 15 years these taxes. Can I borrow against this piece of paper? Yes. He gets the money, he builds the project, uses that bank loan to pay those investments off. And then he's got the note at the bank to pay for. He's got the income from his taxes to pay for. So he's borrowed money from the bank that he doesn't have to pay off because his taxes pay off the stream. So that's the gift. We do something a little more conservative in North Platte than some other practitioners do. A lot of other practitioners say at the beginning of the project, okay, here's a bond. Let's do a $100,000 project with a $2,000 tax bill. They'll give you $30,000 over time, and about half of that's going to be interest. So we have a $15,000 TIF bond. And so the promise to pay is we'll pay you $15,000 plus whatever interest Ty Lucas is going to charge you. The interest on that bond starts running the day that it's issued. Principal and interest, like a note at the bank. That's not the way we do it here. We have a process where you have to show that you have invested those dollars in the eligible categories, and then you have to give us a copy of the bill, and you have to give us a copy of the canceled check, and you have to give it to Don with the certification that that is an appropriate expenditure. And then if that passes the test, that portion of that expenditure is endorsed on the back of the bond, and that portion of the expenditure of the $15,000 bond is then starting to draw interest, just a little bit of it. And as the project goes along, they continue to certify those costs up until the maximum amount. That's good for a couple of reasons. Number one, a couple years ago, we had an audit of all of the TIF projects that were done, or at least some of them, and they wanted to see where every cent of the project went from the state auditor. Well, we had to go ask people for all of these documents, prove that you expended them in the right place. We don't do that anymore because all of those expenditures are in a file. Angie keeps all of the documents for the TIF process, all of the documents for the blight process. Don keeps all of the documents for the finances. It's in a file, and they say, knock yourself out. Every cent that we've authorized for a TIF bond is in that file. And I would put up pretty big money about anybody trying to slip one past Dawn. So, anyway.
Mike, can I ask a quick question? So the interest rates have gone up lately. What effect does that have on this whole process? If the interest rates have doubled from what they were a couple years ago?
The question is, what happens if the interest rates have gone up? We have a lot of bonds issued in the 4, 5, 6%. Those bonds are issued and they're stuck with that rate.
Yeah.
The rate right now to borrow has gone up, well, it's doubled pretty easily in the last year. So the rates on the bonds are higher because it costs more money to build. So they're set up there at a higher rate. What that means is the principal amount that you are going to be able to get from the same valuation has shrunk.
Okay.
So you used to have a bond that might be worth 20% of your project, now is maybe 10% of your project, because so much of it has to go to interest. So,
Okay, thank you.
yep,
Mike, can those bonds be refinanced then?
they can. You have the ability to do that. We have not, I don't think we've done one of those here. I can't remember. I've done some. Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's another limitation we have to live with. This amount of money that we give back to the redeveloper can only be used in certain categories. And this is the list of the categories. Buy the land, do the demo and site prep, do almost any infrastructure, including utilities up to the foundation and those sorts of things, sidewalks, the planning, engineering, and architecture expense. And the recent change, because Lincoln was doing this and it wasn't authorized, was enhancements in excess of local design standards. In other words, back in the old days, you couldn't build a building, but you could do all this other stuff to the land. Now you can do something in excess of what North Platte generally requires for design standards. Heating and air conditioning, you have it super insulated, high efficiency units, perhaps triple E glass, those types of things. Or you can have a brick exterior where your building code says it could be wood or plastic or whatever. So something like that that has a value. And so the amount of that value can be, the amount of that increase or excess can be an allowable expense. The interesting thing is you can rehabilitate any existing building, and all of the rehabilitation costs are eligible expenses. The demo, the redoing it. Now you can't do a scrape and then build a new building. You have to have some remainder of the old building there. The last item here, which you were the first community in the state to use one of these qualifications. In rural communities, which is essentially anything other than the Omaha metro area and Lincoln, you can actually use those TIF dollars to build workforce housing. And you can do it for apartments, and you can do it for single family. And there's a limit on how much you can spend, and it goes up each year at a level. There's a limit per door that you can spend. But if you think about it, if you have a lot that already has a street in front of it, already has a sidewalk, the only thing you could use TIF for is digging the hole for the foundation. So in this case, we were able to get the Schultz project. They had the site, they had everything done. they were only gonna be able to qualify for like $70,000 or $75,000 worth of eligible expenses. That was not gonna get the investor from Omaha to come out and invest in 48 apartments. But if we could buy down the cost, and I think it was like $750,000 or so in TIF, that made the investment worthwhile. You got apartments for your, that are up and running and already paying TIF taxes back. But for that TIF, you would not have that development. So that is a very handy piece of the project. The Victory Village that you approved this time also was there, and believe me, that thing has been a real struggle to get launched, and without that piece of the law, the 120 units would not be going up, so it's a good deal. So here's the fun part, and this, I tried to calculate on my own, but then I emailed Don, who has this very detailed spreadsheet, which is wonderful. Of the 27 TIF projects in the city of North Platte, the total valuation to date of all of those, including the ones that are paid off, is $94,289,784. It's been added to your assessed valuation. Of those dollars added to the assessed valuation, $62,989,695 are no longer paying TIF taxes. They're paying all of their assessed valuation to your community. So if you think about this and you multiply the $62 million, almost $63 million times your 2% tax rate, you're getting $1.2 million in taxes that you would not have otherwise had in North Platte towards your school system, your community college, towards lowering the taxes or holding down the increase that you would not have if you had not done those TIF projects. Because remember, we have the but-for test.
And my quick question, that's
Yep.
an annual number, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, just to clarify.
Yes. Yeah, it's not fixed.
Yep.
It
I'm
rolls.
curious, Mike, where Dawson County's been more aggressive, where do you think those numbers are in Dawson County?
I have not looked, but what I will tell you is the little town that I live in has done as many or maybe a couple more TIF projects than you. And our valuation from the first time we did it until today has increased by a factor of 5. Your valuation is $1,748,000,000. About 1.76% is off books in TIF right now. That's year-old data. That's not Don's up-to-date data, but this is published at the state level. So I have one community that I've done 76 projects in. They're more active, and they're more active in the housing area as opposed to anything else. Taking a look, there's an annual report you can get, and I think the big bump in that number is from Walmart Distribution Center. But otherwise, about 50% of your projects are residential and 50% are commercial or industrial, kind of, somewhere in there. So that doesn't have the sustainable beef on there or much of the impact out at the industrial park yet. So
I have a quick question. So.
I thought you were going to fall asleep.
I'm trying, but it's too exciting. So my question is, when we look at communities that are growing quickly, how do those those compare to our TIF rates? What are they doing differently, et cetera, et cetera?
There are, where do I have the numbers? Like 68 counties that are doing the TIF projects. They understand that that TIF is an investment and not an expense. And this is an investment in raising your tax payers. If you have a static population and a static or decreasing valuation, you have a problem. And so one of the issues that you look at over time, and I've been doing this about 20-some years here, and your population has been dead level, doesn't fluctuate 500 or 600 people over time. And I saw one mayor that was excited because the valuation in our town went down. We won't have to pay as much in taxes. Yeah, that's not something to be proud of. You want the valuation to go up. Economic activity begets economic activity, which drives that $1.2 million to help pay for somebody else's taxes. And again, think about if you didn't have Menards. I don't know what their sales tax is, but somebody does. Hobby Lobby, huge tax benefit. You get people driving to town. All of the hotels, those people are paying taxes and they don't live here and they don't require you to provide services to them. So that's how you drive the value down. And you get the double whammy with TIF. You clean up stressed areas in your community, and you get someone else to come in and invest dollars, and you make a deal. You invest, we'll help you do that. But then, baby, you're on our tax rolls for the next 50 years paying taxes. Think about it this way. Here's a test. What year was North Platte incorporated? The mayor is looking at the city administrator who's looking at the mayor. Okay. There's some houses here that were built back then, or maybe before then. At least 1% of your housing stock is going to become unusable every year. You can't rehab it enough times, or it's too small, or it didn't originally have a bathroom, or my kid isn't going to move into it, no matter what it looks like, because on HGTV there's some nicer houses. So if you've got, how many electrical hookups do you have, Lane?
Well, residential, we have about 8,800.
How many?
8,800.
Okay. What's 1% of that? That's what you've got to replace to stay level. So you've got to get way above that if you want a population growth. The other data point is you used to have 4 members per household. Now in Lincoln County you have 2.23 members per household, so you need more houses. So this is a way that you can make that investment. Statewide, we have about $5.3 billion in TIF projects, and about just less than $1 billion of that is for housing. I've seen a number before that Nebraska's somewhere between 40 and 50,000 housing units short as we sit here today. This is my closing quote. I'd be glad to answer any other questions. I would like to say one thing. I've been a city attorney and doing TIF for a long time. You guys don't get paid a nickel an hour for what you do. And you do important stuff, all of you. Some of you don't even get the nickel. So thank you for what you do for North Platte. You are the widest spot between Kearney and Denver on Interstate 76 and 80. So go get them, North Platte. Thank you.
Mike?
Anyone have any, oh, go ahead, Ed, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What are the qualifications for somebody to do a blight study?
There are no statutory qualifications. Everybody that we refer to has someone that has been trained generally at the College of Architecture in community planning. And so there are about 4 groups that I make recommendations to, that they all follow the same basic standard, which includes looking at every building in the area, looking at the underlying data of when it was built, what the assessed valuation is, looking at each structure and talking about what each structure has in terms of shortcomings and whether it's bad, medium, or okay. So they go into great detail on those blight studies.
So there's no particular standard that outlines or qualifies somebody to do that work.
Not statutorily, but everything that I see, they use essentially the same format.
And the collateral for the TIF bond, that is essentially the future tax payments that are gonna be made
Right.
on the property.
That's correct.
And if for some reason, that doesn't materialize, the holder of the bond, which may or may not be the developer, is on the hook for that, is that correct?
That's true.
I heard you say redevelopment plan, and I heard you say redevelopment contract.
Yes.
Is that one and the same?
No, that's 2 different things. The redevelopment plan, which is presented to you, is the broad outline with a lot of detail about what is proposed to be developed. Once you bless that, then the details are left to the redevelopment authority to hammer out with default provisions, with provisions for building, how they will interact with city for design and payment of city-related costs, bonds that have to be provided to make sure that there aren't any mechanics liens, and design standards.
So what happens if we get into a circumstance where the developer has signed a contract and the TIF bond ends up getting paid, so there's no outstanding loan against that property, at least not on the TIF. And the contractor doesn't, the developer rather, doesn't fulfill the remainder of that contract. In other words, he says he's gonna build 5 buildings and he builds 4. What does the city have, what leverage does the city have to obligate the developer to follow the contract?
In every one, there's a liquidated damage clause that is related to the unpaid TIF bond. What your,
Okay, but you said the unpaid TIF bond. What
Yeah.
if the bond is paid off?
then if the obligation is, there are 2 pieces. You have substantial performance because what you're trying to get as part of the redevelopment contract is the structure or business up. So when that is done, that's the primary qualification. So that's generally the tail end. Now, some of them are unrelated to that time, which is in the mall, you have maintenance provisions and so forth. Keep them all looking good. There's an enforcement mechanism in sustainable beef for odor control and how you resolve that. So some of those go past. But the primary object is to do 2 things in a redevelopment project. One, get the area cleaned up and a new investment there and get it up. Now they can, paint it lime green because those generally aren't the standards, but you can put some of those standards in that go beyond that. The enforcement for that piece of it is generally through a court action that would be extended longer than that.
Extended longer than what?
Extended longer than the 15 years.
So the contract isn't over at the end of 15 years necessarily.
That's right. It can have claws or teeth past it, yes.
So if the contractor says, I'm gonna build 5 buildings and he only builds 4, then the city would have to take that developer to court to
To
either make
enforce.
him, make him build that fifth building, or pay the city some kind of damages because he didn't.
If
fulfill.
those kinds of details were put in there. We've not done that yet. One of the reasons is, if you would have had a contract, for example, to build so many houses before the pandemic hit, which stopped a lot of stuff and doubled costs a lot, then you would have be in the position where you didn't build a fifth one. Yeah, I couldn't. And so in those, the practical piece is not the option that you talk about. The practical piece is you're not going to get any more TIF. I've not seen one yet where we have build 5 houses and the first 3 or 4 pay off the TIF bond, because what they've done is put in very expensive infrastructure, and so they need that last one to pay off the infrastructure. So the case that you have is this developer is giving to the city the right of way for the street, the sewer, the water, the paving, curb and gutter, storm sewer, all given to the city at no cost and no liens. And then his penalty is going to be at the bank. I don't have enough money coming in off of taxes to pay you off or to pay off the TIF bond. And that's where all of those pieces hit. Now, we have had 2 failures of TIF projects in this town, I think, where the businesses failed, but the structure's still up and the bond payments are going through.
I guess one of the reasons this comes to my mind is with the inflationary cycle we're currently in, which seems to have no end in sight, that means that the valuation of that property is going to continue to escalate, which means that the differential between the original taxable value and the new taxable value is going to increase at a much greater rate than what maybe was projected when the bond was put forth, which means that in essence the bond should be paid for early.
Not necessarily. You have to do an analysis of every project and the price. That assumption only works in a small, limited numerical set. It's still back to the numbers, the original project, and I've not seen a projection where that circumstance reflects reality. So
I guess I'm concerned, and maybe it's not a valid concern, I don't know, that we get into a circumstance where we have somebody that's made a promise to build something and they don't complete it. And then the city has no repercussions or no ramifications to come back to that developer and obligate him to complete his contract. And I guess
Sure.
one of the things that, I don't see government's responsibility to guarantee the profitability of somebody's business.
exactly. And TIF is set up so that government doesn't undertake that. The classic example that you just raised, you just passed 2 days ago. Because the plan was to get you 160 apartments in 2 or 3 phases. They couldn't. And suing them wasn't going to get anybody anything. But doubling down and assisting them with a local investment and the workforce housing TIF was able to get it across the finish line. So that's, this is a public-private partnership to get these done, yeah. I would be glad to sit down and run some numbers with you, but I recognize that I've done a few hundred of these and have not run into your
And I understand.
situation, yeah.
I think maybe we're in a different time too, though, when we look at 7,
It is a
8, 9%
different time.
inflation.
A different time,
It's
yeah.
gonna change everything, so thank you for your answers.
Thank you. Any other questions?
One last question, and I'm cutting him off at an hour. So go ahead, Donna.
I have a whole list.
Ask your best one.
Okay, so it's what I've seen anyway, if a area is deemed blighted and substandard, whatever. So they're authorized for the TIF, but they're not authorized to go fix what allowed them to get the TIF. Is that correct or not correct?
No. Generally, you want them to fix it, knock down the buildings or put in infrastructure that's non-existent or, yeah.
What about cracks in the sidewalk and cracks in the street, weeds coming up in a neighborhood that they studied to develop this
Oh,
flat land out
okay,
here? So-
okay. So you generally have a much larger blight and substandard area than the developer can buy. But what you have is the tool available for anyone in that area to go in and fix. Just because you say, here's my circle and this is blight, doesn't mean that TIF fixes it all. TIF can only be generated, or dollars to fix stuff, if there's an increase in valuation. So we have to have something that increases the valuation. Now, there is a way that you can go in and say, for these 4 ugly blocks, we're going to capture any increase in taxes that occurs over the 4 ugly blocks, and we'll use those funds to help people improve their houses. Give them a grant to do that. But that is a long, slow slog, because sometimes that valuation doesn't come up very fast. With your housing crunch that you have here, I've not looked to see what your assessed valuations are doing, but it may be possible in some of these areas to say, all right, without hurting any landowner, because they're going to have to pay those taxes anyway, we'll capture all of the taxes in this 4-block area, and then as applications come in, we will help fund new siding or new roof or new furnace, some things like that. So it is possible. It is a tool that you can use to do things like that. But you have to have someone come in that has money to do the improvement.
Complicated. So we have developers here in town that are still developing houses, they're putting the streets in, sewers and whatnot.
Mhm.
So and they don't qualify for TIF.
Good.
Exactly. So I guess my concern is that there seems to be or could be an unfair advantage. And it's common knowledge, I guess, that it's North Platte is a high business district, high cost here to develop. And I think it is because the competition isn't great here, so people can charge higher, more. So my question is, how do we just make it a more even playing field for our local developers that don't get TIF? Because they feel like there's a disadvantage to them.
If they have the capital to do it, the law is clear. You can't make it fair. Okay? The law says there has to be economically not feasible for that person. If it's economically feasible for someone else, we can't use TIF to fix that. We can't level a playing field with it. The law does not allow it. Our heart might be there, but why would you give away a tax base for someone that can pay the taxes?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bacon. We appreciate it. Sorry to cut the discussion off. We will have Mr. Bacon back for TIF 201 at some point.
There will be a test for the next one, I'm just saying.
Okay, that's fine.
you all.
All these kind people behind you who have donating their time, I would like to let them eat dinner at some reasonable chances. And if Mr. Bacon hangs around, maybe you can quiz him more after the meeting. Now, okay, Bill's promising me he'll be efficient here. We're going to skip on to presentation regarding the Nebraska Open Meetings Act. As soon as Bill gets his technology going here real quick. Don't actually put the "and eggs" on there.
I'll put down bacon and eggs.
All right, everyone. I was asked or instructed by the mayor to put on a bit of a presentation here about the Open Meetings Act, so don't everyone fall asleep at the same time. We will keep it open for questions, so if anyone has questions, feel free to stop me. I know the Open Meetings Act is an incredibly exciting presentation, so I'll try to add what flair I can, but for those of you that know me well, you know that will be a challenge. So, the Open Meetings Act, obviously it applies to what we're doing here today. The Open Meetings Act was passed by the legislature with a specific intention. That intention is to allow citizens to exercise their democratic privileges of attending and speaking at meetings. So, the reason that we have the Open Meetings Act is to make sure that, it applies to those of us that are here and in these public meetings, but the reason we have it is for the citizens that we're representing. The main purpose of the public meetings law is to ensure that the public policy that we're formulating here in these meetings is open and available to the citizens at large. So the question becomes, and I know this is pretty small, so I'll just kind of hit the high points. The Open Meetings Act doesn't apply to everyone. The Open Meetings Act only applies if you are considered a public body. And so on the left-hand side there, any of the political subdivisions of the state of Nebraska, that includes cities. All cities are included as public bodies. Also, the second to the bottom on the left-hand side, advisory committees of the bodies referred to in Subdivision 1. That would be our planning commissions, our CRAs, our public service commissions. They're not just advisory committees all the time. Sometimes they have the ability to make certain findings. But generally, everyone is here, falls within the definition of a public body. I know there are other types of organizations that we don't necessarily deal with here, that it becomes much more difficult to determine whether it falls within that definition. So we're lucky we don't have to deal with whether we're going to be a public body or not. We know that we are. But if you look at that last definition there, an instrumentality exercising essentially public functions, well, what does that mean? What's essentially a public function? I mean, it's pretty broad, as we say. Public bodies don't include a smaller committee like a subcommittee, so there are some specific things in the statute that are excluded, but generally if you don't have a quorum of the public body, then the public meetings law does not necessarily apply to what you're doing. If you have a quorum, it does. So, this is an important part of the Open Meetings Act, but providing notice as to what is going to happen at the meeting and providing an agenda are very, very important things. And what the law requires is this reasonable advanced public notice. So under the law that was LB 148 passed in 2020, there were some changes made as to how that notice was provided. For a city of the first class, it still requires that notice be published in a newspaper of general circulation. If available, published also on the newspaper's website. The city also still continues to post notices of meetings in different places around town, and so that is something that is also provided for under the law here. With an agenda, what exactly should we have in the agenda for the meeting? Number one, it has to be kept continually current, and it can't be altered less than 24 hours before the scheduled meeting. There is one small exception if there were something of an emergency nature that you would need to handle. That would be pretty rare. Something of an emergency nature under those circumstances would be it's even hard to think of a good example because it's so incredibly rare. So for the most part, you know that if you want to add something to an agenda, you should have it done a good couple days before the meeting itself. In 2021, there was some new language added to the statute that requires a governing body of a city of the first class to make the agenda available on its website. So that is a newer thing. You'll notice that the city does do that. And again, that agenda has to be placed on the website at least 24 hours before the meeting. And then we do have some requirements where we have to keep those agendas available even after the fact. So as far as specifically what needs to be included in the agenda, there's a lot of legislative history as to exactly what needs to be in the agenda, but the key term is that it needs to be sufficiently descriptive to give the public reasonable notice of the matters to be considered at the meeting. And so apparently what had been going on with some public boards is that they were maybe providing notice, but you had to look back in previous agendas to even know exactly what kind of action they were taking. The legislature didn't feel like that conformed with the law. So they made it more clear for us to know that the public has to be able to look at the agenda and know that it's not just a third reading on an ordinance. It's third reading on a specific ordinance, and the public has to be able to know what the purpose of that ordinance is. That is a sufficiently descriptive notice for purposes of the Open Meetings Act. So, what happens, I'm sure all of you are sitting here thinking, what exactly happens if we're not following the Open Meetings Law? I'm sure that's something that keeps all of you up at night, just like it does with me. So, circumventing the Open Meetings Act, what happens there? So, there's a specific statute, this 84-1410. It says that you cannot circumvent the purpose of the Open Meetings Act, which is to make this information available to the public, by doing things like designating subcommittees, trying to meet in smaller groups to make decisions that would go before the larger group and get rubber stamped, so to speak. So those are the types of things that are considered circumventing the Open Meetings Act. This particular section, as the slide states, also prohibits the use of a closed session, an informal meeting, chance meeting, social gathering. Then you see some of this too, which this has become, I think, more important in our day and age, where email is also mentioned, where you're trying to do things out of the open public meeting in order to circumvent the purpose of the act. So that's a big no-no. So I'll just read from the slide itself, but the Attorney General has indicated that intent is a necessary element of the element of conduct prohibited by this statute. And so that's not to say that you can't talk with a member of the board or the council outside of a public meeting. In order to be found to be circumventing the act, you have to be trying to keep the information out of the public eye. It's still okay to have a conversation with another council member or another member of the board that you're on, but what you can't do is try to keep that information from becoming public ultimately in a public meeting. So the communications themselves are okay, but if you're starting to do it, say, through email, where you're directing an email to the entire council to talk about how the council should go about doing something, that would be considered communicating with the whole body, because a quorum would be involved if you're sending an email to everyone. And you know, depending on, I guess, of what the context of it is, you could be trying to circumvent the Open Meetings Act. So what I would say is, generally it's better, if you're going to have conversations with someone, it's better to keep those conversations to smaller groups. Don't try to communicate with the board or commission or whatever it is that you sit on as a whole outside of the public meeting.
Can I ask you a question on that one?
You bet.
So, if there's like 5 of them on the board, what if you email one of them each at a time? Is that different than circumventing that, or?
So it's, the question is, what if email individual members of the board that would constitute a quorum, basically. It's hard to say without knowing the exact context of what you're emailing, because again, you can still communicate with other members. You can't do it for the purpose of circumventing the Open Meetings Act. And so it really, in my opinion, it depends entirely on the context of what it is that you're talking about. If you're talking about not allowing something on the agenda and trying to keep it off the agenda, you know, maybe that's something that would be circumventing the act because there's somebody that wants something to come forward and you're not allowing it. So that may be an extreme case, but best example I can think of off the top of my head.
How many constitute a quorum?
It depends on the size of the board that you're on. So generally it's a majority is generally, so that's where it gets a little bit difficult to answer, because say with like city council, there are different numbers that are required for different actions of the board. You know, so a quorum generally though is going to be at least a majority of the board. Okay, so now that you've been thinking, I'm going to stay awake tonight and think about how not to circumvent the Open Meetings Act. Well, if I screw up and I do that, what happens to me? What are the enforcement actions that are out there? So it's kind of a two-pronged approach as far as enforcement actions go. Enforcement can mean either action is taken against the board that you sit on, but it also, the law also provides that action can be taken against you personally. So if you really want something to keep you awake at night, just don't circumvent the Open Meetings Act. So I apologize, this is pretty small here. If anybody wants a copy of this PowerPoint, I'm happy to get it to them. So it's not anything that's proprietary or anything like that. And to be honest, if you do want to learn more about this, I know we're trying to get through this quickly tonight. There's a lot of information out there on the Open Meetings Act. I would refer you to the Attorney General's website. They have a lot of good information available on because the Attorney General is one who interprets provisions of the Open Meetings Act, but also is allowed to pursue violations of the Act itself. So for actions for enforcement, again, these different items here kind of talk about what can happen to the board as a whole. And so I don't need to get down into the weeds with all of this, but more or less, if the Open Meetings Act is violated, and someone challenges that, a public citizen can challenge any action of a board or council, and they can file a lawsuit to challenge that action that was taken in violation of the Open Meetings Act, and the court can more or less set aside whatever that action is. So with my city attorney hat on, my thought is that there's still a way, even if there was a violation and it was challenged and set aside, you could still come back and try to rectify that after the fact. So I think that's an important thing to note for anyone, just so you know we don't all lose too much sleep tonight. But as I said, the Attorney General, but also the county attorney of the county in which the public body meets, are allowed to enforce the provisions of the Open Meetings Act. So if you don't know Rebecca Harling, make friends with her, and hope she doesn't come after you. For criminal sanctions, I mentioned it was kind of a two-pronged approach. If an individual member of a public body knowingly violates or conspires to violate the Open Meetings Act, you can be found guilty of initially a Class 4 misdemeanor. And if there are second offenses, you could be found guilty of a Class 3 misdemeanor. So I think it is important. This obviously isn't anything that anyone wants to do. It has to be more of an intentional act, so you have to be knowingly violating it. So hopefully nobody gets into that type of a situation, but just be aware that there are these criminal sanctions that are out there. So I have a little bit more information. This is more to kind of the legislative history of some of this, but on the far right there, it talks about what the punishments are for these misdemeanors. So a Class 4 misdemeanor is punishable by a fine of $100 to $500, but no imprisonment. Class 3 misdemeanor, that would be for the second offense. It's punishable for up to 3 months of imprisonment or up to a $500 fine, or both, with no minimum penalty. So gets really serious, obviously, if there are more than one violation. So,
Okay, Bill, stop there. They're all going to resign.
bottom line, don't try to violate the Open Meetings Act. So, just a couple more quick slides and we'll be through the Open Meetings Act presentation. I wanted to have a little bit on a closed session, when you can have a closed session. The Open Meetings Act specifies that there are only specific reasons why you can go into closed session. And so it has to be necessary for protection of the public interest or prevention of needless injury to the reputation of an individual if the individual has not requested a public meeting. There are some other reasons. On the next slide here, you can have strategy sessions in regards to more or less negotiations involving contracts, things like collective bargaining agreements, real estate purchases, also things involving litigation. So those are all permitted under the Open Meetings Act to go into a closed session. You can also go into closed session for these other items. I don't think we have to worry too much about deploying security personnel or devices around here, so we shouldn't have too much question about that. But another big one is, again, things like evaluating a job performance of an employee, that type of thing. If they haven't requested a public meeting, that type of thing, we would see that less here on the city level. That would be maybe more of like a school board type situation, where you would worry more about that type of thing. So a little bit about email correspondence, and I figured that would be kind of a segue into our next presentation. But obviously, like I had mentioned earlier, virtual conferencing is now allowed under some circumstances under the Open Meetings Act. It's very specific as to when a public body can use virtual conferencing, but that's things like Zoom. So we don't worry too much about that here, but other things like emails and other electronic communication, which in my opinion would involve even, say, like a text message, you're not supposed to use those things to circumvent the public government purposes in the Open Meetings Act. And again, the point of that is that it's not that you can't have any communication about things. It's that you can't be trying to have that communication to avoid things being brought into a public light, or keeping it from the public. So I threw in also a few, these are just some citations from either letters from the Attorney General or from some court cases, but you can see this one comes from an Attorney General's opinion. The most difficult determination which must be made in any specific case involving serial communications by members of a public body is whether those communications have reached a point where they are sufficiently developed so as to evidence an intent to circumvent the act. So think about that a little bit. But the way that I read that is that obviously you can have communications, but if the communications go on too long and you're having too much discourse over a certain topic, you may want to think, well, maybe this is something we should bring to the public meeting. Citing guidance from a case from the Southern District of Texas, the court in Nebraska here said, informal discussions among members of a public body under the circumstances can take the place of or substitute for a formal deliberative discussion of the public body's actions with respect to the purpose before the public body, thus violating the Open Meetings Act. So even, again, you just have to, I'm not trying to scare everyone too much, just a little bit, but even informal discussions, you have to be careful and don't take them too far. So again, under these circumstances, the defendants went beyond a minimal exchange of correspondence or minimal electronic communication when they started making all these phone calls to the entire board. So even though it sounds like there were separate telephone calls here, so to the prior question, it depends. If it goes on too long, that could be seen as violating the Open Meetings Act. So under these circumstances, the board members acted in concert to discuss and decide an official board business in private. And that's what you want to avoid.
Hey, Bill, quick question.
Yes.
So since we live in a really nice but fairly small community, it's not uncommon on a weekend that multiple members of any one of these boards might all be at the same fundraiser. I mean, that, we've all seen that happen, or the same event, or whatever, even in the same restaurant, you know, that can happen. So what is some guidance on, in those circumstances, to avoid any appearance of violating the Open Meetings Act?
I would say the easiest advice would be to limit your conversations to social and personal topics and not discuss public business.
So don't all sit at the same table, for example, or
That would
something
be
like
helpful,
that. Yeah,
yes.
okay.
It would make my job a lot easier because I wouldn't have to, you know, explain things away as much. But, you know, partly I think when you're dealing with the Open Meetings Act, part of it probably is a bit of perception. And so if you all go to a public event and you're all standing around talking in a small group, the public perception is that, oh, city council or planning commission or whoever it is, they're up to no good, they're over there conspiring against us. So probably, in my opinion, best to try to avoid that. That's not to say that you can't talk in groups, and again, that's why I think the easiest advice I can give is just try to keep the group smaller and don't make sure, you know, even if you would have a quorum. Again, chance meetings are not, chance meetings are okay. You can have chance meetings with people that you sit on boards with and you can talk with them. But I think as part of what these cases that I cited, it's when it goes beyond a chance meeting. And so, you know, a chance meeting here, but then you decide you're all going to go out for coffee afterwards and you're going to continue talking about the next subdivision that's being proposed. I would suggest not doing that. You know, it's better to have those conversations at the public meeting.
Thank you.
You bet. Okay, and again, we're going to get into email correspondence here a little bit. Just, you know, I think it's good to be aware that email correspondence does factor into what we talk about here with the Open Meetings Act. So you just need to be aware of it. We'll talk a little bit more about some suggestions and tips on what to do with all of the emails that you get, because I think it's fair to say anymore everybody gets a lot of emails about stuff. And so the next presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about what should you be doing with some of those emails. How do you handle them? How do you manage them? And it's important because email correspondence can be seen as something that may be open to the public and may be subject to the Open Meetings Act. So I believe that was all I had here. So again, I'm happy to share any of this information with anyone. If anyone wants to do a little more reading on their own, the Nebraska Attorney General's outline of the Nebraska Open Meetings Act is a very good resource for you. So, anybody have any other questions? Good, I beat you into submission. That's better for the next presentation, so. Okay, you want me to just jump right into it? So I had someone younger than me put together these PowerPoints, so they're a little flashier than what I would normally probably do. My personality is probably a little bit more like Mike Bacon's, so they would have been a little more like that. All right.
Similar. I note that you have a similar hairstyle as well.
Some would say there's some similarities there. So, all right. So next we're going to get into a little bit about email retention. I'll fully admit this is something that can be a bit dry because we start to talk about some different regulations as far as guidelines and that kind of thing about how to keep emails. So I'm just going to throw this out there. If you take anything away from this, take this away from this presentation. What you do with an email depends entirely on the context of the email. So, you know, as everyone gets all of these emails for all these different public boards that they're on, I think it is good thing to keep in mind. There are retention schedules and things like that for how long you should be keeping some of the emails that you get. I would say organization, if I could give you advice from just the way that I handle all the emails, for me it's all about organizing them, putting them into folders to be able to reference later. There's one slide where we talk about things like litigation holds. Those are things we hope we never ever have to get into, because that's when you're retaining things forever because there's litigation going on. So again, I'm not trying to scare everyone, but part of the reason why the mayor has the attorney speak here is because we want to scare you a little bit. So on with email retention. So ultimately what we're talking about, when you receive emails as part of a public body, you have to have in the back of your mind a little thought about how to manage those emails. If you are corresponding back and forth with someone about something, it's generally not a good idea to just immediately delete all of those emails. I would suggest to you that, like I said at the outset, you have to consider what the content of the message was, so that then you can decide a little bit on your own what to do with that email. So in my opinion, it's a good idea to set up folders and to keep some of those emails organized, so that if you would need to refer back to them at a future point, you can do that. So that's where when it says emails being classified, stored, and disposed of, that's the best way to go about it. We'll get into a little bit of the retention schedules here too, just to make sure that everybody's good and ready for bed tonight. So this was a little bit of a flow chart that I kind of borrowed from. It was from a state administrative agency, so their flow chart was much more descriptive and in depth. But this gives you a little bit of an idea, just from my perspective, what do you do on the behalf of the city for an email that you receive? Again, you have to think, how is this email related to the board that I'm serving on? Is it related to anything related to the work that I'm doing for city council or planning commission? If it's not, dispose of it. So one of the examples that was given by the state agency that I borrowed this from would be things like listservs. So if you receive like any planning and zoning newsletters or things like that, although it may be somewhat related, if it's from a listserv, it's not specific to you, you can get rid of it. So from there you start to do kind of a further analysis. Did you send or create the email? If you did, then if it pertains to any kind of a decision that you make, you're going to want to keep it for a while. If you receive the email, is it anything that you need to forward on to someone else, for example? Or does it, I'm not sure, I guess, what I mean by explain or justify a decision, but if it's relating to the work that you're doing on the board, maybe a constituent that's upset at you about a decision that you made, it's not a bad idea to retain it. Now, again, that doesn't mean you have to retain it forever, but it's not a bad idea to keep it for a bit. So here's where we really get into the fun stuff. These are the retention schedules that are provided for by state law, that are approved on a state level. Again, I'm happy to send these retention schedules to anyone that would like to see them. These specific schedules pertain just to local government, and so I threw this screenshot up onto my slide because it pertains specifically to communications. So if you look at the bottom three, not everybody has to deal with public records requests, so maybe it's more kind of the event-driven communications, but this would be a communication with more of an open-ended, event-driven retention period. So it depends on what category that you fall into. And you can see with some of these retention schedules, for something that the mayor may receive, he may need to keep it for 5 years, but then also send it on to state archives. Whereas if you're a city council member or a board member, if it would fall into this category, the retention period is only for 5 years. So I threw a few more of these up here. This particular retention schedule, it comes as part of a PDF, so I'm happy to make sure anybody can review this if they would like to. Otherwise, it breaks down these types of records into really different types of, whether it's medium term, long term, short term, or even a communication non-record. So if you see that, the second line from the bottom, communications not related to government transactions or activities and are not included in another agency's specific schedule, you don't have to retain it. For a short-term communication, you only need to keep it around for 6 months. So, again, they don't give you a lot of specifics as to what exactly that is. So if anybody has questions about any of this kind of thing, we're always here to answer those too. I threw this one up here just because it pertains to meeting minutes and materials. So obviously when we're sending out agendas and that type of thing, the Open Meetings Act requires that those be sent to all board members. So when you receive those materials, what do you do with them? So this particular retention schedule gives you a little bit of direction. The clerk's office would retain that information permanently, but all other copies, if you haven't made notes or anything like that on it, then you don't necessarily need to, as it states, when no longer of reference value, you can basically get rid of it. So if you worry about what to do with, say, like the email where you receive the agenda, you don't reply to it, you don't forward it on, you don't do anything with it, that's something that's already being kept by someone else. So you can get rid of that email. That's okay.
Bill, if they ask for something as simple as, are you going to be there or not, you reply to that agenda, does that trigger a longer retention period?
So that question was, see if I can succinctly state that. If it's a very simple reply about whether you're going to be at a meeting, I think that would fall under some of these retention schedules, and so I would consider that probably, I could look more closely at it, but I would think it would be more of a short-term retention, so maybe you hold on to it for 6 months but generally does it pertain to the work that you're doing? Yes, because you're going to be at the meeting. So I would say, and again, I'm going to give you the most conservative answer that I can, so I would say that it's probably going to fall within something there. I would say good question, but it came from David, so it was an okay question. This again, I threw this up here because it talks about non-record material. So it gives you, again, this one at least gives you a little bit more information as to what can fall within the definition of that non-record material. But if it's non-record material, it can be destroyed at any time. So. Again, it's more thinking about what is the content of the email. Is it something that somebody else is already keeping track of, like the clerk's office? If it's something like that, you can get rid of it. You don't have to worry too much about holding on and filing that away in a separate folder. So, again, emails that are of more significant nature, you definitely want to put you want to file those away and hold on to them. Something that is more short term, you may want to hold on to it for a short period of time. The retention clocks, that kind of, it's a little bit harder to get into, but with a retention clock, again, it's hard to say if it's an open-ended event-driven thing. What exactly is the future date or event? We don't have to get into the weeds about that right now. I think what I really wanted to get across to everyone is that just be aware, because of the Open Meetings Act requirements, because of communications that can be had by email, you do want to just be aware that maybe some emails you want to keep, you don't want to necessarily delete all of them. You don't necessarily have to keep all of them either, though. So if we do get into a situation where we've got a legal hold, then, well, we've got another conversation to have. But legal holds are really pretty serious, and you don't delete anything when that happens. But a legal hold is something that is communicated to you. The attorney says, hey, we're on a legal hold, don't get rid of any of your communications. And that's when you know. So you know when you know with the legal hold. But so again, just kind of reiterating what I just said, you know, you have to think about the content of the email. So hopefully that is all super clear, so nobody has any questions for me ever about emails.
Just the record books, I made Bill do this, just so you know.
Yeah, very, very exciting topic. So thank you, Mayor. It was fun to look into it further. But again, the reference schedule that I mentioned, this schedule number 24, pertains specifically to the boards that we all deal with here in this room. There are numerous other schedules on the state level that deal with state agencies or state bodies, and so this particular one that I was referencing tonight just deals with local agencies, which would include all of us here. So thank you, everybody, for your time.
Do we have any questions?
Just real quick, not to belabor this issue anymore. No one wants another email, but would it be advisable for us to have a public email on the website as well as an email for communication, or is that unnecessary?
So I don't think it's a bad idea. You're talking if you have, say, like a separate email for all
Like a
your city
CSI,
council business.
like, you know, like the city people have.
In my opinion, it would be much easier. So say worst case scenario, you get into a situation where there's a legal hold and we need to see what all of your communications are, or, you know, even if there's a public records request for something that you sent to someone. If you are using only your personal email account for all of the city related business, then the concern is that draws potentially some of your personal business into that request. So the simplest way in my mind to do that would be to separate it out. Just have a completely separate email. Don't use your personal email for any of the city business and keep it separate.
Okay. Because I would think that the IT department could set up retention guidelines also and purge after 2 years, 5 years, whatever. I don't know, just an idea.
But yeah, I don't know if that's what the mayor wanted me getting into.
We'll talk about it.
Okay.
But it also, you know, going back to just some other, I'll try to think of just some practical guidance too. You know, as far as for any of the city staff or administrators that is sending members of the boards different things, it's always a good idea to use that blind carbon copy or the BCC so that somebody maybe doesn't inadvertently respond to everyone and you know, include some kind of a message that is going to be considered circumvention of the Open Meetings Act. So, you know, there are those other little things that we can do too that I wanted to try to just point out tonight. So that's one little thing. I don't know if the mayor has other ideas or suggestions as far as email use.
I think you pretty much covered it. So,
Perfect.
do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. I would appreciate all your time and your service being here tonight. I wish I could take you all out for a frosty beverage, but of course that would be a violation of the Open Meetings Act. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you all other times.
Just pick your favorites.
Meeting is adjourned.
Mr. Bells,
Yep.
could I get those presentations, please?
Yeah. I'll email them
Thank
over
you.
to you.
Appreciate it.
Hi, Don.